Shalom. Welcome to the Jewish View. My name is Rabbi Nachman Simon with the Chabad House of Delmar, and we have a very special guest with us today, Mr. Sandor Schuman. Sandor, welcome to the Jewish View.
Nice to be here.
Well, as we can see that you're an author, and we will talk about the book, but tell us a little about yourself and how you got to be an author of this interesting book. We'll talk about it in a minute.
Well, I'll tell you how I got interested in storytelling.
All right, good.
This is just a written version of stories that I've told. Some of them I wrote before I told. But as I suppose is true of a lot of kids, my father told me stories at bedtime. And in fact, there was one story I think I asked for over and over and over again. I don't know why. And there wasn't really anything more to it than that. He was, after school, they'd play dodgeball with the boys. And the one kid would stand in the middle with the ball, and there'd be a ring of boys, and he would throw the ball, and if you got hit, you were out. And one day they're playing dodgeball, and nobody could hit him. He won the game. It was time to choose up sides for the next game they were going to play, and none of the teams wanted him. And so he walked home. That's the whole story. Somehow I love to hear that story, and I love to hear him tell stories. And I had this idea going to sleep at night that there was a young kid sitting on this old man's lap, and the old man had this big book in front of him, and it was the story of me. It was my day. And as he came to the end of the day, as I came to the end of my day, the old man would come to the end of this page in the book, and he would close the book, and the little boy would go to sleep, and that was the end of my day. And I had this idea that in the morning I would wake up and I would think about the little boy climbing into the old man's lap, and they'd open the big book and they'd start reading the story of me. I never thought of that, though, in the morning. I only thought of it at night. Anyhow, like all of us, I grew up with stories. And as an organizational consultant, in training programs and workshops, apparently I told stories. I really wasn't aware of it. It was just, what I did. But I was sitting after a workshop, and we have these evaluation sheets, and on the back of the evaluation sheet it says, what did you like best about the workshop, what did you like least, questions like that. And my colleague, who was co-training, doing this workshop with me, picks up the sheet, he looks at it, he passes it over to me, and I read one of them, and it says, what did you like best about the workshop? And somebody writes in, Sandy's stories. And I didn't know what they were talking about. It didn't connect. I just laid it aside, I didn't know what to make of it. Next one comes over, I look at another one. What did you like best about the workshop? Sandy told some really good stories. All right, I just put it aside. By the time the next one comes around, I really liked the stories that Sandy told. I turn to my friend, I say, Freeman, that's his name, Freeman. What are they talking about? And he says, don't you remember you told that story about the time the group threw you out? And you told the story about the time when you were all prepared except you didn't have any flip charts or markers. And he listed these stories. I thought, oh yeah, I told all those stories. So that's when I found out at a conscious level that I was a storyteller. And Helm stories.
Do you think it comes back to your youth, or like it's in your genes? Anything from a lot of people say they have a talent to know my parents and my grandparents.
Funny you should ask. I have to tell you another story.
Yeah, right.
We don't answer questions with straight answers. We only tell stories.
All right. Everybody loves a story, they say.
All right. In a prehistoric time, a small band left the camp to forage for food. And they wandered farther than they had ever gone. They came to a steep ravine, and they were about to head down one side of the ravine, and then of course they'd have to climb up the other. One of them had an idea, and he motioned everybody over, and they lifted up this tree, this fallen tree, and they stood it up on end, and they tilted it so that when it fell, it crossed the ravine. And they went across this steep ravine, across this tree. It was the first bridge. As they were going by, one of them broke off a branch sticking out from the tree and used it as a walking stick. And pretty soon they all copied it, and they all had walking sticks. Finally, they came to a big field full of berries, and they're filling their pouches with berries, and one of them is attacked by a bear.
Yeah.
They start to run away, and one of them grabs a stick and starts hitting the bear, and they all bring their sticks, and they hit the bear. They chase the bear away. Their comrade is hurt from this bear attack. They want to head home, and they realize they're lost. And one of them has an idea, climbs up on a tall tree, sees the camp over in the distance, points the way, and they find their way back. When finally they got back to the camp, they so wanted to tell their story that they invented language. Who knows? Maybe that's how it happened.
That's how you're 5,000, as we say, man is 5,000 years old. So here you are 5,000 years later telling stories.
Right. I don't think we can not tell stories.
Well, you know, usually even in Hasidic terminology, stories, because again, there's philosophy, which is always deep, but complicated, just like it is in, you know, in your college seminars. It's complicated. But it's interesting, they would say everybody loves a story, everybody can relate to a story, but inside the stories are sometimes the deepest ideas. You think something you don't understand, philosophy, like I say, it's so complicated and you can't get it. Ooh, there must be something really deep, I can't get it. You need a college degree to get into these classes. And a story, anybody can understand a story, so it must be a simpleton, and it's just really the opposite. They'd always say in Hasidic literature, sometimes in the cute little nice stories are the absolute deepest ideas in the world.
Right, and I think from a parent standpoint, from a rabbi standpoint, from an educator standpoint, I think a really useful thing to do is to say, here's something I want to communicate. Here's something I want my student, my child, my colleague to learn. I want them to understand this thing. What's the story that I can tell? And if you can figure out how to tell it in a story, you're, I think, more likely to have an impact.
You're right. Excellent. So now we can get into why you picked a Jewish story to write about.
Well, there's a couple of oddities about this. One was that, you know, I kind of like Helm stories. Sometimes they seem too simple to, you know, there's no message there. It's just a silly story.
Why don't you go back maybe to the, I mean, I know Helm stories, but just for our viewerships, where does Helm stories come from in Europe, and, you know, the background, and get into your extended Helm story.
You know, many cultures in their traditions of storytelling have a particular type of character that is a, you know, the sort of person whose understanding of cause and effect is, you might say, twisted. The kind of person whose willingness to believe the unbelievable exceeds the bounds of gullibility. The kind of person who is so confident of their wisdom, they're unaware of their own foolishness. So we have this type of character that appears in storytelling traditions across the globe, the fool. Now, in the Jewish storytelling tradition, we don't have such an individual. We have a whole village, the village of Helm. And so the people in this village do these inconsequential things. You know, they see that the moon is bright at night when it's dark, and we need that light. So let's capture the moon so that on a moonless night we'll have light. And so they try to capture the reflection of the moon in a wooden barrel. Meshuggah. But that's the story. You know, we have the story of the Helmite who's going to travel to paradise. And so he packs up his belongings in a horse-drawn cart and heads out to paradise. I actually have a variation on that story in this book. It's a motorcycle now. It's a little modern, you know. You know, in that story and in the version in the book, the traveler has to stop for the evening along the side of the road. And in the book, it's Bloomy, one of the characters, and she's on her motorcycle. And she's on her way to Paradise. Paradise, New York, by the way. Yeah. There really is a Paradise, New York. And she's traveling from Helms Pond, which is Taka, also in New York. And she gets about as far as Amsterdam, and it's nightfall. She's got to take a rest. She parks her motorcycle and points it in the same direction that she's going, so that when she wakes up in the morning, she won't be confused. She'll just be able to get right on the motorcycle and continue on her way. Unfortunately, as she's asleep, this motorcycle gang shows up. And they think they're going to have some fun with this young girl in the middle of nowhere on the side of the road. And they're going to play a trick on her and turn the motorcycle around so that when she wakes up in the morning, she'll get on the motorcycle and she'll be heading in the wrong direction. They've also tampered with her GPS and changed the coordinates for Paradise to the coordinates for Helms Pond, so when she pushes Paradise, she's going to head back to Helms Pond. And that indeed is what happened. She wakes up in the morning, she heads back to Helms Pond, and she's in such a rush to get away from these motorcycle guys that she's not really paying close attention. She does notice that things look familiar, and she gets back and there's the same trail, you know, that it looks just like Helms Pond, you know. Paradise. Paradise must be that Paradise is a place that you're already familiar with. And, you know, these two old people come and greet her, and they hug her, and they're so glad to see her, and they offer her a job, one that she's familiar with. She says, wow, Paradise is great. You know, you meet people that welcome you without even knowing your name, without asking who you are, and they offer you a job right away. So it's that same idea that, you know, Paradise there's no place like home.
It's interesting. It's a nice story. I mean, sometimes I read a lot of Helm stories, and I did read your book, but sometimes the truth is they're just silly and odd, like with the moon, you know, you sing Moonlight. But that was an interesting, you know, like the example like that. Paradise is maybe where it's right in your home.
Right. Right, and you know, one of the things going on in my head was, you know, if you think about the Helm stories, like the capturing the moon in a wooden barrel, traveling to Paradise in a horse-drawn cart, the school teachers get trapped in an iron chest. You know, we don't have iron chests. Do you have a wooden barrel next to your house?
No.
You know, I personally do not own a horse-drawn cart. You know, those stories, the character of those stories is old. It's from another century. And so I thought, you know, maybe we should modernize this a little bit. So what happened to these people from Helm in Poland? And so I actually tried to find a Helm in New York. I figured, what the heck, there's a lot of Jews here. Let's put them in New York. And so, you know, Google Maps and MapQuest, I'm trying to find Helm in New York. Of course, there is Chelmsford in Massachusetts.
All right.
But I wanted something, nothing. And I did find Paradise, but no Helm in New York. So I thought, okay, Hanukkah. We spell Hanukkah in English very often with an H.
Right.
I'll look for Helm.
Yeah.
And I found Helms Pond in the Adirondacks. So this is it. It's an anglicized spelling. It's Helms Pond, and it's in
the real place.
There is a real place. In fact, in the book. Yeah. So you didn't study the map, I can tell. Yeah. On the back page here, we'll stick it out here. On the back cover of the book, this is an actual topographic map. Here's Blue Mountain Lake, And right there between Castle Rock and Little Blue Mountain is Helms Pond.
Well, I did see it, but I didn't know if you were making it up or not.
Well, it's a real place. Yes.
It was very interesting taking a Europe. Well, you know, why? It's interesting. Let's back up. Why did you think to modernize these Helm stories? I mean, I always liked them. I did read the originals and things like that, and they were cute. And I thought it also was very interesting you did it. But maybe there's so many things to write about. Why did you focus in on Helm?
It's a good question, and it deserves a good answer. And as soon as I come up with one, I'll let you know.
Just you probably liked a lot of Helm stories, right? I mean, you're right. And then you tune up these old stories to modernize them.
Well, once I found Helms Pond in the Adirondacks, then it introduced another element. And I'm actually more fond of tall tales, Paul Bunyan, Pecos Bill, American West, and there are tall tales of the Adirondacks. Bill Greenfield, Joe Call, the Essex County giant. These were real people like Johnny Appleseed, but who had legendary reputations. And I was familiar with some of those stories. And I decided to create Adirondack Ashkenazic fusion. And so we have Adirondack Mendel coming into Helms Pond to marry Bloomy, and he's telling tall tales. So it's there are
it's a mixture of the culture.
Right.
But that's interesting because you do that a lot of times. He has Jewish music, and they say it's the thing is Jewish music. It was just music where Jews were in Europe or now in America, and they pick up these songs and they just like what you're doing, infusing them into the, making Jewish words into maybe just the native language or the native culture. So I guess that's what, maybe even Helm, they did that, or you're surely doing that. It's interesting, making a Jewish idea and molding it into the American or upstate New York, even that upstate New York culture.
Well, for us, it's quite local. Yeah.
It's good. Well, it's interesting. Really, know you, and then gave me the book, and I read it, but it hasn't gone in the Jewish mainstream, or I haven't seen it. I'm asking really because it is interesting. It's it has a cute variation. Most Jewish people they're Jewish minded. Shall I say they had no Helm stories, and here he's saying modern Helm stories. It's got a cute little take on it. So that's what I'm thinking maybe would take off.
I'm hoping.
Yeah.
It would be nice to have it, on the New York Times book review, but I don't think that's a likelihood.
Maybe the forewords, which I don't know if people are familiar, it's more of it's English, but it used to be a Yiddish and Jewish newspaper written in the Yiddish, the Jewish language, and really it's gone downhill because most Jewish people in America do not speak Yiddish, but they do have the same kind of idea in an English paper. So they do these kind of, that they would pick something like that up.
Well, I'm in the process of trying to get the book reviewed by, the forward or other publications. So stay tuned.
All right. So then it would be part 2 or something. You have other ideas?
Well, yes. Funny you should ask. But, this collection of stories ends with, from the title, Adirondack Mendel's Ufruf. Not the dog Ufruf, the Ufruf before his wedding. So
just explain it for people.
You
I know
explain
what you're saying about, but there's bachelor parties which are not Jewish at all, but what they do in Judaism, which is more serious. Marriage is serious, not just let's have fun time. Even though of course there's bands and parties to say the least, but it's also very serious. And the Sabbath, the Shabbos before the marriage, that the groom, the Chatan, the groom gets an aliyah, and he's get called up to the Torah, because again, it's very serious. You want to be elevated, and an aliyah, which is called being called to the Torah, means an elevation, to be elevated to a higher spiritual level to get to be married. So he's making a play on words, and this ufruf means, it's really Yiddish. It's not Hebrew, to be called up. So when he's called up to the Torah, to get a special honor. So that's really the basic Judaism, and now I
right. And actually, I've imagined that perhaps the genesis of that custom was that the wedding would be in the bride's community, and not everybody from the groom's community would be able to come. So to share the simcha with the groom's community, the ufrup in the groom's community would help to do that. That makes sense?
That makes sense a little bit. They do that. I mean, even now that people, we're in the Capital District, and people get married a lot of times in New York, sometimes for convenience, and more people there, and I think financially also it's a little more economical. But then, not everybody can take off a day of work on a Tuesday night, and 3 hours down, and 3 hours back, and back in the middle of the night. So again, a lot of times they have sheva brachas, or there's parties after the marriage, but it's decent. Not everybody's going to make everything. So usually Shabbos, when everybody, the Sabbath, when everybody is supposed to be in the synagogue, and mainly that's your biggest attendance, obviously during the week, that at least they have a party for. It's an interesting idea.
So in this case, Adirondack, Mendel, and Blumey are going to get married, and Blumey has a reputation, which is in another community they would say of Blumey that she was not the sharpest knife in the drawer, or she was a few colors short of a rainbow. She was as sharp as a bowling ball. In Helms Pond, they would say, she couldn't find the hole in the middle of a bagel. Yeah. She couldn't remember which was her side of the Eruv. You have to explain that one.
Yeah, I know. You're too many Jewish terms. That one of the works on the Sabbath, on Shabbos, is not to carry. You can carry inside your house, but you cannot carry from inside or to the outside, or walk around the street carrying anything. So it's not the biggest problem in the world, but a lot of times people have baby carriages, and you can't ask a 1-year-old to walk to the temple, to the synagogue, and different needs. So there is a rabbinical kind of a loophole that they make an eruv. They put a string around, and not to get into all the details, everything's more complicated, but a string around the city, and the city of Albany does have one. You're not going to notice it because they actually use the telephone wires, so I don't think anybody really even notices it. But it is a Jewish law technicality, and that means that there's a string around the city that really becomes one big private domain. And even though it's obviously there's a street, and you can't just go into your house. Now your house is your house, my house is my house. Doesn't mean we're all in one happy family. But in any case, that's what I'm saying, it's a loophole, and then a person would be allowed, since they're in one private domain, to carry from their house into the street, into the temple. And she can't figure out.
Right. So to say that somebody can't remember which is their side of the Eruv, they're not. They're all foam and no beer. Yeah. So one of the one of the things I wanted to do in this book was to use Yiddish terms, Hebrew terms, Jewish ideas, and how are you going to teach people this stuff? Tell a story. So this is supposed to be a humorous book, but it has footnotes and a glossary. So to try and explain these things.
I think it's very important. It's interesting, and I have said this myself. And of course, as a rabbi, you say mitzvot, you go to the temple and the commandments and do the real Jewish things. But I think I always said that even a societal idea, a lot was lost from the previous generation. You're talking 40, 50 years, and even like the grandparents, they're 80 years old. Hey, I walked down the street and there was a bakery there, the Jewish bakery, that I'd walk down the block, and that was really very impressive. It wasn't like, well, I remember so much Passover, which they do, but was just like, oh, there's the bubby, the grandmother. She was down the block. We got a cookie from her. And, you know, when we live in the suburbs, there's no Jewish bakery. And even now, there's a bakery. It's in the middle of a supermarket with everything. You know, you don't feel like, oh, here we go into a Jewish atmosphere. And those old people always had such fond memories. And I'm not talking about even religion now. I'm just talking about, like you say, Jewish culture that kept them Jewish, because the bakery's there, and someone's down the block there, and the synagogue's 2 blocks down. So if they went, they went. They didn't. But they knew the synagogue was 2 blocks. You know, they felt Jewish just walking down the street. Where, I mean, maybe I'm not saying New York City, you probably could feel that in some neighborhoods, but in the Capital District, you know, no one nowadays feels, oh, I'm in a Jewish neighborhood. Jewish people are scattered in all the different suburbs, so it's not a ghettoized for good or for bad, and surely there's no Jewish bakery and no Jewish butcher shop down the road. So, you know, and I think that really is a detriment to the Jewish people. So even that exterior, so to speak, maybe it's not a mitzvah to speak Jewish or Yiddish. You know, you can be a good Jewish person without speaking it, but still there is something lacking when that culture was gone.
Right, it's part of the bigger picture. Well, so Helms Pond being centrally isolated in the Adirondacks, I mean, here's this community, albeit pretend, but that's all they have. Speaking of the kosher restaurant that we don't have in Albany, of course they have the broiled beet in Helms Pond, which was Bloomy's parents' cafe, restaurant, whatever they called it. And she takes it over as a young adult and calls it the broiled beef. And they're too poor to have a shochet, a
ritual slaughter.
All right, so they don't, and they can't afford, to import kosher meat. So the whole village is vegetarian, and so Bloomy turns the broiled beet into, instead of being a vegetarian because you're poor, she makes it into the gourmet kosher vegetarian restaurant, and
21st century
right, and she invents Adirondack Ashkenazic fusion cuisine. Yeah. I like to say the broiled beet, home of the peanut butter and gefilte fish sandwich.
Maybe.
Yeah, that's right.
You know, Sandor, we're out of time, unfortunately, because it's really been interesting. Maybe we'll have to ask you back, and I know there's more stories I'd like to tell and different things that we can talk about in the Jewish culture. But, it was very entertaining, and everybody, like I said before, everybody loves a story. And so they have more of an insight into Jewish culture through your stories. All right, so
I hope so.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.